Hello, everyone. We are looking at a story that, if it were to unfold in reality, could become one of the most consequential moments in the history of global trade, technology, and geopolitical power. For decades, trade wars followed a familiar pattern. One country imposed tariffs. Another country responded with tariffs of its own. Steel against steel, cars against cars, agriculture against agriculture. Pain was exchanged, negotiations followed. Eventually, some form of compromise emerged. But what happens when countries stop fighting with tariffs? What happens when they discover a far more precise weapon? A weapon capable of targeting not entire industries, not entire economies, but specific corporations, specific executives, specific technologies, and specific political alliances. According to the scenario described in the report, Canada and the European Union have taken a step that would send shockwaves through every boardroom in America. Rather than responding to U.S. tariffs with traditional countermeasures, they allegedly move against one of the most recognizable American technology platforms in the world, Starlink. If such an event were ever to occur, it would signal something much larger than a dispute over satellite internet. It would signal the arrival of a new phase of economic warfare, a phase where governments no longer target products, they target permissions. And that changes everything. For nearly 80 years, the global trading system operated under relatively predictable rules. Following World War II, Western economies built institutions designed to reduce economic conflict. Trade disputes still occurred. The United States challenged Japan in the 1980s. Europe challenged American agricultural subsidies. Canada and the United States fought over softwood lumber for decades. But despite the rhetoric, most disputes remained confined to tariffs, quotas, and regulatory investigations. The logic was simple. If one country raised costs on imported products, the other country would do the same. The damage would be shared. Neither side wanted to escalate too far because both sides would suffer. This system created natural limits. But the modern economy is fundamentally different from the economy of the 20th century. Today, some of the most valuable assets are not factories. They are platforms, data networks, cloud systems, artificial intelligence infrastructure, satellite constellations, digital ecosystems. And unlike physical products, these businesses often depend on government authorization to operate. That dependency creates a vulnerability many investors never fully appreciated, because the government does not need to seize the asset. It only needs to revoke the permission. That distinction sits at the center of this entire story. To understand why Starlink appears at the center of this scenario, we need to understand how satellite internet actually works. Many people imagine Starlink as a space company. In reality, Starlink is a regulatory company disguised as a space company. Every satellite crossing above a nation requires legal coordination. Every customer terminal depends on radio spectrum. Every ground station requires government approval. Every communication pathway depends on regulatory agreements. Without those permissions, the technology becomes irrelevant. The satellites can still orbit Earth, but they cannot legally serve customers, and that creates an extraordinary vulnerability. Unlike a traditional manufacturer that can relocate factories, satellite operators require ongoing cooperation from national governments. Spectrum licenses, ground station permits, data routing authorizations, orbital coordination agreements. All of these are government-controlled permissions. That means regulators possess leverage that few investors fully account for. And according to the scenario, Canada and Europe recognized exactly that. The immediate financial loss from losing subscribers would be significant. But that is not the real story. The real story is precedent. Because once governments discover a new tool, they rarely forget it. Think about what investors would suddenly realize. If a satellite company can lose market access through regulatory revocation, what about cloud computing companies? What about AI companies? What about social media platforms? What about payment networks? What about digital advertising giants? What about software providers handling sensitive government data? The implications become enormous. The European Union already regulates large technology firms more aggressively than almost any other region on Earth. Digital Markets Act, Digital Services Act, privacy regulations, competition rules, data localization requirements. If trade conflicts evolve into regulatory conflicts, American technology firms could find themselves exposed in ways that traditional manufacturers never were. The risk would not be limited to Starlink. The risk would become systemic. That is why, in the scenario, major technology firms allegedly begin reassessing their exposure to foreign regulatory environments. The fear is not one company losing access. The fear is a new doctrine spreading globally. Perhaps the most important concept in this entire story is digital sovereignty. For years, governments tolerated dependence on foreign technology because efficiency mattered more than independence. American cloud services were cheaper. American software platforms were more advanced. American digital infrastructure dominated the world. But geopolitical tensions have changed the conversation. Governments increasingly ask a different question. What happens if access disappears tomorrow? Europe has already spent years discussing technological independence. China has built entire industries around reducing reliance on foreign systems. India has pursued domestic digital infrastructure. Canada increasingly talks about strategic autonomy in key sectors. The motivation is not always economic. Often, it is political: control, security, resilience, national sovereignty. In the scenario, both Canada and Europe accelerate sovereign satellite programs to replace dependence on foreign-controlled communications infrastructure. Whether or not such programs succeed is almost secondary. The strategic direction is clear. More countries want infrastructure they control themselves. Perhaps the most fascinating part of the scenario is the underlying strategic logic. Historically, tariffs hurt both sides. Consumers pay higher prices. Supply chains suffer. Businesses face uncertainty. Political pressure rises. But the scenario introduces a different philosophy. Instead of imposing broad pain, governments identify specific vulnerabilities. Instead of targeting products, they target dependencies. Instead of punishing entire populations, they pressure selected corporations. That shift represents a fundamental evolution in economic statecraft, because modern economies are increasingly built around permissions: licenses, approvals, certifications, data access, communications rights, banking authorizations, cloud infrastructure, digital networks. The countries that control those permissions possess leverage that may be more powerful than tariffs themselves. And that is the strategic lesson investors would take away from this scenario. The most important question is not whether Starlink survives. A company with SpaceX's resources would almost certainly continue operating. The bigger question is what happens next. Because global markets operate on expectations, investors do not wait for risk to materialize. They price risk in advance. If regulators demonstrate willingness to use operating permissions as geopolitical tools, investors begin reassessing every internationally exposed company. Risk premiums rise, expansion plans slow, compliance spending increases. Localization efforts accelerate. Countries build duplicate systems. Efficiency declines. Redundancy increases. The global economy gradually fragments, and once fragmentation begins, it rarely reverses quickly. What started as a tariff dispute could evolve into something much larger: a technological decoupling, a communications decoupling, a data sovereignty race, a restructuring of global digital infrastructure. That would be far more consequential than any tariff headline. For decades, the world assumed economic power came from controlling factories, resources, shipping lanes, and financial markets. But the 21st century may reveal a different source of power: permission. The power to authorize, the power to regulate, the power to approve, and the power to revoke. If governments increasingly use those tools as strategic weapons, then the next global trade war may look nothing like the last one. It may not be fought through tariffs. It may not be fought through sanctions. It may be fought through licenses, data access, communications infrastructure, and regulatory approvals. And if that happens, every multinational corporation will face the same question: not whether they can build the best technology, but whether they can keep permission to use it. So here's the question for you. Are we entering an era where regulatory power becomes more important than economic power? Or will traditional trade tools remain the dominant weapon in global competition? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. Because if this trend continues, the future of globalization may depend less on what companies build and more on what governments allow.